Welcome to BitBlitz Horror. Tonight's reading is Whispers in the Static, a tale about a midnight radio shift spiraling into terror. If you enjoy chilling stories, be sure to like and subscribe for more horrors lurking in the darkness. Let's begin. I've always found comfort in routine, which is probably why I took the job at the remote listening station in the first place. Each day follows the same pattern. Arrive at the facility, greet the guarded gate if someone's there to wave back at me, step inside the squat concrete building, and settle into the small control room with its array of blinking lights and dials. My primary duty is simple: tune the large band receiver to the designated frequencies for the day, ensure the logs are up to date, and document any anomalous signals for future review. That might sound dull, but there's something hypnotic about the static, the gentle hum of equipment, and the faint pulses that occasionally spike across the screens. At times, I wonder if I'm truly alone in this strange occupation, or if somewhere out there, another person like me sits huddled in a different metal chair, listening to the same emptiness of the ether. Perhaps we're kindred spirits, unknowingly joined across invisible waves. Tonight, it's only me again, as it always is after midnight. I pulled up to the station while the moon hung low and orangey over the barren landscape. The wind whipped across the gravel parking lot, rattling the chain-link fence with an almost desperate urgency. I stepped inside to be greeted by near silence, just the soft hum of overhead lights and old hardware. My shift was supposed to be uneventful, as it usually is, but something felt different right from the start. I couldn't pinpoint why at the time. Maybe it was the air, slightly more charged than usual. Or maybe it was just the memory of a half-remembered nightmare prickling at my mind. With a resigned shrug, I settled into my seat. If there was something off, I told myself, I'd find out soon enough. I flicked on the main receiver and began scanning through the first set of frequencies, noting each minor blip or pop of static. This was routine. Tune in, listen for anything that might stand out, log the time code if it does. On some nights, I'd catch a snippet of an amateur radio conversation or a piece of music drifting through on the waves. Most people might consider it eavesdropping, but my job was purely mechanical: document, record, move on. Despite the dullness, I'd grown to appreciate these quiet hours. The slow swirl of static can sometimes calm my racing thoughts, and in the gloom of the dimly lit control room, I could just be alone with the receding echoes of my own mind. Tonight, the pattern repeated itself at first: low static hum, an occasional fuzzy transmission in an unfamiliar language, and the standard bursts of random electromagnetic noise. Then I reached the last frequency block on my shifts list, a region that rarely carried anything. I braced for the usual monotony, but that was precisely when I heard something different. At first, it was soft, barely above the normal static, like a muffled whisper. My ears perked up, and I leaned forward, gently turning the dial to sharpen the signal. The sound was akin to a breath against a microphone, or perhaps a rustling from an open line. A fleeting thought crossed my mind: maybe it was just the wind or some glitch in the equipment. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became there was an intentional pattern beneath the hiss. I turned up the volume, heart kicking a little faster. And that's when I heard what sounded like a voice. Not words, exactly, but the distinct cadence of human speech. My breath caught in my throat. I'd never encountered anything like that on this band before. Curiosity and dread warred within me, but the job demanded that I keep listening, and so I did. As I inched the dial further, it felt as though I was tugging at threads of a secret tapestry that someone had hidden deep within the static. The faint speech began to form clearer syllables. I pressed the headphones tight against my ears, ignoring how my palms started to sweat. The tone seemed urgent, like someone trying to speak rapidly but having difficulty forming the words. Every so often, a sharp crackle would pierce my ears, making me wince, but I was determined not to let go of that elusive signal. Then came a moment of clarity, crisp enough to raise the hairs on my neck. A word, or something close to a word, reached me. It sounded like, "Hello?" But it wasn't quite right. The voice had a crackling undertone, as if there were two voices overlapping, one deeper than the other, both struggling to synchronize their syllables. Never mind who it belonged to. There's a primal fear that arises from hearing something that doesn't sound entirely human. I debated calling my supervisor, but it was long past midnight. Protocol said that if I picked up an unusual signal, I should record it, mark the time, and carry on. Yet a voice like this felt too abnormal to simply log and forget. I took a deep breath, started the recording system, and cleared my throat as if the voice on the other end could hear me. "This is Station 17, I said quietly, unsure why I was speaking at all. "If you can hear me, please continue." Of course, I didn't expect a response. We're not exactly a two-way radio station, but some part of me, a latent curiosity, compelled me to try. The static changed pitch slightly, like a wave cresting in the ocean, and then the voice returned, nearly swallowing my own breath. It spoke in fragmented phrases, half lost to the atmospheric noise. I struggled to grasp meaning, as random bursts of static devoured entire bits of speech. Still, I caught something about "beyond the edge too late" and "find me." My heart hammered. Each word resonated with an uneasy weight. I wondered who or what was broadcasting this. A trapped explorer on some distant mountain? Some clandestine experiment? Or maybe, in a more mundane sense, a stray snippet from a phone call bouncing off the ionosphere. Rational explanations exist for odd radio signals, after all. But in that moment, rationality felt flimsy. Something in my gut told me this was not a coincidence. I scribbled furiously in my logbook, trying to note timestamps for each phrase. Then the static crescendoed, as though a ghostly hand had seized the microphone on the other side. The whispered, layered voice escalated into a harried plea, if I heard it correctly. "You must not open door if—" And then a sharp screech cut it off. I leapt back, the shriek drilling into my ears. The lights in the control room flickered once, maybe just a power fluctuation, but in that moment, every nerve in my body was alight with fear and adrenaline. Panting, I looked around the cramped space, half expecting something to burst in. Nothing came but the low hum of the HVAC system and the blinking of LED indicators on the equipment racks. Still, that flicker of the fluorescent lights felt ominous. Dread pulled in my stomach. Maybe that voice was a hoax. Maybe it was a chance alignment of cosmic radiation forming a pattern that sounded like speech. But I couldn't ignore the unmistakable heaviness in the air, like the station itself was holding its breath, waiting. Sleepiness was gone. I felt more awake than ever. Every flicker of shadow along the walls magnified in my peripheral vision. The overhead lights gave off a sterile glow, devoid of comfort. I replayed the recorded snippet, listening for anything missed. It was scratchy, but the voice or voices layered within repeated their cryptic message. There was that phrase again. "Beyond the edge." I had no context for what it meant, and my mind spiraled with questions. Was this a code? Was someone in danger, trying to call for help? I glanced at the clock, just a bit after 1 in the morning. I had hours left in my shift, and I didn't think I could stand them if the broadcast continued. Against protocol, I switched to the microphone feed, an old piece of gear rarely used. "If you can hear me, are you in danger?" I asked, voice trembling. The question hung in the silence. Then a thin whine built up, modulating through the headphones, and rose to a near painful pitch before suddenly cutting off. I almost tore the headphones off, but the hiss of static returned just in time. I listened intently, biting my lips so hard I tasted blood. There was a single sigh-like sound before the faint voice came through again. but I couldn't decipher the words this time. I felt an odd compulsion to leave the station, even though I'd never abandoned a post. The building that usually felt secure and mundane was steadily transforming into a labyrinth of unknown terrors. The hallway leading to the exit seemed longer, the corners darker. Still, I wouldn't dare leave until I understood more. In a flustered gesture, I double-checked the locks on the main entrance. Everything was secure. Perhaps this was just some weird broadcast from a pirate station or a bored radio hobbyist messing around. Yes, that had to be it. Yet my instincts screamed otherwise. An hour passed with me perched at the console, occasionally flipping to different frequencies, but always returning to that same one, hoping for more clues. My nerves were frayed. I tried to distract myself by reading old shift logs, looking for any similar incidents. Page after page showed the usual routine. 2:13 a.m., heard static, one short beep. Possibly atmospheric. 3:02 a.m., weak music station from overseas. No anomalies at 4:20 a.m. It was dull reading, which was a testament to just how unusual tonight truly was. I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe I was overblowing a series of random distortions? But the spoken words were too distinct, too sentient. I checked the recorder again. The waveforms indicated something undeniably structured. Pausing to stretch my neck, I noticed goosebumps running up my arms. The temperature felt like it had dropped a few degrees, though the thermostats read the same as always. The HVAC system was working, presumably. So why did it feel like the chill of an unseen presence was clinging to the back of my neck? I took inventory of my surroundings. The thick steel door to the main corridor was closed and locked. I glanced at the security camera feed and saw only the empty hallway swallowing fluorescent light. The monitors for the exterior grounds showed nothing but wind pushing tumbleweeds across the gravel lot. Yet, I felt anything could be lurking just outside the frame. The sense of being watched was almost unbearable. With a trembling hand, I reached for my thermos and took a swig of lukewarm coffee, as if that could ground me. My job was to monitor, and so I pressed on, waiting for the signal to return. At 2:45 a.m., it returned, more forceful than before. The static parted like a curtain, and I could hear heavy breathing, followed by what I can only describe as a muffled sob. Then a voice, shaky, layered with that strange harmonic undertone, pleaded, "Please, they're coming, can't hide." My throat tightened. It sounded so desperate, so painfully human. Immediately, I hit the record button, making sure every syllable and hiss was captured. "Who's coming?" I whispered into the microphone, though the station's equipment isn't designed for two-way conversation in the conventional sense. The sobs continued for a few seconds, and I swore I heard footsteps in the background. Then there was a dragging noise, something that made my skin crawl. Could it be an actual location mic picking this up somewhere? Impossible, I told myself. Unless someone was illegally hijacking the channel. Yet the more I listened, the more it sounded like this voice was too close, almost inside my own headphones, bypassing the concept of distance. My heart thudded in my chest, creating a rhythmic background to the chilling soundscape. Suddenly, the voice changed. The layered effect grew more pronounced, and it sounded like two different people speaking the same words in unison at slightly different pitches. "Don't listen, they lie, you must see." There was a final gasp, followed by a thunderous burst of static. I nearly jumped out of my chair. Gripped by confusion and dread, I made a note in the log. 2:49 a.m., distress call on frequency. Conflicting voices. Reference #red1. My pen shook in my hand. That was the standard procedure, labeling an anomaly as red if it seemed urgent. I was certain this was the strangest thing I'd ever documented. The next few minutes were maddening because the channel went silent again. No voice, no breath. only the subtle hiss that could mean anything or nothing at all. My eyes were locked on the readouts, half expecting them to spike. Time inched forward. Each second seemed to echo in my head. The overhead lights irritated me, their continuous hum adding another layer of anxiety. My entire body was coiled like a spring, waiting for the next jolt. At some point, I realized I couldn't just sit here, passively listening. The desire to explore was overwhelming. Something had changed in the air, a gravity that pulled me toward the corridor. I rationalized it by remembering that the building isn't large. There's a generator room, a break room, a server closet, and storage. Everything is connected by a single corridor. Before I knew it, I found myself leaving the control room, stepping into the hallway with cautious footsteps. The moment I exited, the door clicked shut behind me, and I felt an irrational surge of panic, as though it might lock me out. But I pressed on, flicking on the flashlight I always carry on my belt. My breathing felt too loud, reverberating in the narrow space. The corridor stretched ahead, bathed in flickering fluorescent tubes. The generator room door was slightly ajar, which was unusual because I always make sure it's latched. Slowly, I approached, noticing how the light inside the room seemed to pulse. My own heartbeat matched that pulsing, or so it seemed. With a trembling hand, I nudged the door fully open, shining the flashlight inside. The generator whirred steadily, but the corners of the room seemed darker than normal, as though light refused to reach them. I took one step in, half expecting to see something lurking, but the room was empty. Still, the air felt heavy and thick, making each breath laborious. I was about to turn back when I heard the faintest voice, no more than a whisper, somewhere behind me. It was the same layered tone, so quiet I thought I might be imagining it. Behind you! My skin went ice cold in an instant. I spun around, flashlight cutting a frantic circle across the hallway. No one was there. The door behind me slammed shut with a clang, leaving me in near darkness aside from the feeble glow of my flashlight. I fumbled at the handle. It wasn't locked, so I pulled it open and stumbled back into the corridor, feeling like a trapped animal. A wave of crippling fear washed over me. I realized that this was no ordinary broadcast. Something had followed the signal, or maybe the act of listening had invited it into my space. My thoughts spiraled. Could the entity, if that's what it was, be manifesting physically in the station? The rational part of my mind balked. The rest of me was ready to believe almost anything now. My eyes darted to the control room door at the end of the corridor. The station was designed to be secure, with thick walls intended to block interference. Yet I kept hearing that faint voice outside of the headphones. That made no sense unless it was in my head, or in the building. The path to the exit was on the other side of the control room. I tried to calm my frayed nerves, telling myself that if I just locked myself in the control room, I could wait until dawn, or at least until my relief arrived. With that plan in mind, I forced myself forward, step by shaky step, ignoring the persistent sense of being watched from behind. I rushed back inside the control room and locked the door, twisting the heavy bolt for good measure. My breathing was shallow as I slid into the chair before the console. The radio was alive with static again. Nervously, I put the headphones on, my hands trembling so badly that I had to hold them still for a moment before pressing the speaker toggle. I braced myself for the voice to return. For a few excruciating seconds, there was only static. Then, as if conjured by my fears, the layered voice surfaced once more. This time, the words were more distinct. "It hungers for you, the door is opening." I struggled to keep my composure. My chest felt tight, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to flee. But flee where? Outside was a void of darkness, an empty lot with miles of nothingness beyond. And something told me that what was happening here wouldn't necessarily stay inside these concrete walls. A guttural hiss rattled through my headphones, and then the voice offered one final, chilling line. Your eyes cannot see what it truly is. The signal cut off abruptly, replaced by a low rumble that lingered, like distant thunder. The overhead lights flickered again, more violently this time, and for a split second, I thought the power would fail. When they stabilized, I realized tears had gathered in the corners of my eyes. I was at a loss, pinned like an insect by this unearthly broadcast. My job was to monitor, yet never had I imagined I'd be caught in something so horrifying. Part of me prayed that this was all in my head, a stress-induced delirium from too many lonely nights on the graveyard shift. Before I could form a coherent plan, a new sound welled up in the room. Not from the headphones, but from somewhere just beyond the door, in the hallway that I'd just locked. A soft scraping, like claws against the concrete floor. My heart battered my rib cage, each thump echoing through my skull. Slowly, I set the headphones aside, wincing as they clattered too loudly on the desk. The scraping sound continued, measured, methodical. It paused now and then, as if something was sniffing the air. I had no weapon and no idea what I might be up against. The nearest thing I could think of was the fire axe in the emergency cabinet by the front lobby. Between me and that lobby lay a single corridor that, at this moment, seemed inhabited by a malignant presence. The radio static filled the silence in the control room, a cruel reminder that I wasn't actually alone. My head spun with the voice's cryptic warnings. Did it even intend to help me, or was it luring me deeper into some trap? Clenching my fists, I stood up, forcing myself to investigate. If I stayed in the room and that thing outside decided it wanted in, I doubted the flimsy lock would do much. If I went out, at least I had a chance at the fire axe. I leaned my ear against the control room door, hearing nothing but my own ragged breaths and a faint buzz from the fluorescent lighting. Summoning all the courage I had left, I turned the bolt and cracked the door open just a hair. The corridor stretched out like a pale, suffocating tunnel. I heard the scraping again, this time from somewhere off to the right, near the generator room. 1,000 warnings spiraled in my mind, but I stepped out anyway, propelled by a grim determination. The station's long hallway was lined with closed doors, each leading to various utility rooms. My goal was straight ahead, the short passage to the lobby and the front door, where the emergency axe should be. The building felt colder than ever, and I caught a whiff of something metallic in the air, like blood or rust. Step after step, I inched forward, trying not to make noise. The only sound was my heart pumping and the hush of my shallow exhales. The scraping noise stopped abruptly. My stomach lurched as I realized that meant whatever was making that noise had become aware of me. I froze, scanning the hallway for movement. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, flickered once, and then stabilized. In that brief flicker, I thought I caught a glimpse of a twisted shape at the far end of the hall, near the generator room door. The shape seemed elongated, bent in ways that defied normal anatomy, but the lights were too quick in returning, and I wasn't entirely sure if my eyes had just conjured a hallucination in the strobing darkness. Still, fear pounced on me like a predator, urging me to hurry. I quickened my pace, half jogging to the lobby door. The station was a labyrinth of increasingly claustrophobic spaces, but I knew exactly where the emergency cabinet should be. Finally, I saw the chipped red box mounted on the wall. It beckoned like a beacon of safety, holding the only real weapon I could think of. The lock wasn't difficult to break. I slammed my elbow into the glass panel, ignoring the sting as shards rained to the floor. My trembling hands gripped the handle of the axe, and for a moment, I felt a surge of primal empowerment. Then I heard a dull thud behind me. I spun around, brandishing the axe as though I had any clue how to use it effectively. Through the corridor's gloom, shapes seemed to shift in the periphery of my vision. For a moment I thought I saw a dark silhouette leaning around one of the doorways. But as soon as I focused on it, it vanished. The overhead lights buzzed incessantly, intensifying my headache. Blood trickled from a small cut on my elbow, droplets speckling the gray floor with a red pattern that reminded me of radio wave interference images. A low hiss resonated through the hall. It resembled the crackle of static more than an animal's growl, but it conveyed threat all the same. Clutching the axe, I backed up against the lobby's double doors. My mind raced. If I abandoned the station, I'd be out in the pitch-black desert with who knew what trailing me, but staying inside felt equally suicidal. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. Then the voice returned, a whisper circling inside my head. "You see it now, the shape." The words caused an involuntary shudder. I felt a presence behind me, a cold wave washing over my spine. Terrified, I jerked around, axe raised. Nothing but emptiness. Yet that emptiness felt inhabited, as though the air itself was alive. Suddenly, from the corridor leading back to the control room, I heard a door slam open and a metallic crunch, like equipment being knocked over. My heart hammered as I imagined that bizarre shape rummaging through the station, seeking me out. I told myself to run. Any direction was better than here, but a deeper part of me, the part that needed answers, hesitated. I couldn't just leave without knowing what was happening and if there was a chance to stop it. With ragged breath, I set my jaw and crept back toward the corridor. The axe felt heavy in my hands, but it was the only sense of security I had. Going back was a torment of each step, the corridor seeming to stretch impossibly long. The overhead lights dimmed briefly, as though the building was losing power. In that semi-darkness, I caught a clearer look at the shape: tall, unnaturally elongated arms, and a head that seemed to tilt sideways, as if curious about me. My stomach twisted in horror. The thing moved with a jerky gait, rushing forward a few yards, then stopping. I realized with dread that it was between me and the control room. If I wanted to return there, I'd have to pass by it, or confront it. The urgency to preserve my life roared in my mind. If this thing had broadcast that haunting voice, or was connected to it, then it had singled me out. That notion paralyzed me for an instant. But I recalled the pleas through the radio, the sobs, the warnings. Maybe it wasn't this creature that had reached out to me. Maybe it was a victim of this entity, or something else entirely. I tightened my grip on the axe. With a shaking voice, I whispered, "What do you want?" The question sounded painfully small in that wide hallway. It turned its head, the movement abrupt, mechanical, and released a reverberating hiss that echoed the radio static from before. I couldn't see its face, just a void where features should be. My breath caught as I realized that I was seeing this silhouette more with my mind than with my eyes. In pure terror, I raised the axe, stepping forward. If it lunged, I'd swing. That was my entire plan. My footstep echoed, and the thing started to move again, gliding in a way that defied logic. Fear clenched my chest, but something else drove me onward, a desperate need to escape, or possibly to end whatever this was. Time seemed to slow as the creature closed the distance. Every second pounded in my ears along with my raging pulse. Then it lunged, a blurred motion in the dimmed fluorescent glow. I screamed, swinging the axe with everything I had. The blow struck something solid, although it felt like hacking into dense fog. A chilling wail filled the hallway, layered like the radio voice. My hands trembled violently, but I managed another swing. The second strike passed harmlessly through empty air, throwing me off balance. I stumbled, crashing to my knees. A hideous whisper raked through my head. "You cannot stop!" At least, I think those were the words. They were laced with static. Struggling to my feet, I saw the shape flicker, like a bad transmission. It seemed to dissolve briefly, reforming just a step away. In a desperate surge, I swung again. There was a flash, a resonant clang as the axe struck the concrete floor, sparks flying. The shock jarred my arms painfully, and then I felt something cold slip across my shoulder, like frigid fingers gliding over my skin. Instinct took over. I yanked myself free, nearly falling. The shape hovered in front of me, radiating a sense of dread that made me want to drop everything and run. But beyond it, I glimpsed the control room door, open wide. Light spilled out, pulsating with the frequency that had called to me. The creature crouched, and I thought it would lunge again. Instead, it hissed once more, then backed away as if drawn toward another corridor. Its retreat was abrupt, unnatural. Perhaps it sensed something else, or maybe it believed I was no longer worth the effort. With adrenaline overriding my terror, I sprinted into the control room, slamming the door shut behind me. Inside, the radio crackled with what sounded like an insane swirl of voices. They overlapped, repeated fragments of warnings and pleas. "It hunts! Don't open the too late, eyes wide!" My stomach churned as I realized the console lights were fading in and out like a heartbeat. I couldn't stay here. The shape might come back at any moment. Frantically, I gathered the logbook, the recording devices, anything that might provide evidence. Then I made for the exit, determined to outrun this nightmare into the open desert if I had to. The corridor was still empty, but the overhead lights flickered incessantly like a strobe. I clutched the axe in one hand, the recorder pressed to my chest. Each footstep rang in my ears until I reached the front door, heavy, metal-latched, but not bulletproof. My hands were slick with sweat and still trembling. It took me 2 tries to twist the latch properly. With a shudder, I shoved it open. Cold night air hit me like a slap. The desert stretched out, silent except for the wind that rustled dry shrubs. The station loomed behind me, a squat shadow against the stars. For a moment, I wondered if I should destroy the equipment inside, sever whatever conduit allowed that horrifying entity to manifest. But the notion of going back in was unthinkable. My survival instinct screamed for me to leave. The next second, the overhead security light at the gate began to blink erratically. I half expected to see the shape outside, blocking my path, but there was nothing visible. Yet the desert felt far from empty. Every rustle of sagebrush carried potential menace. The voice's warnings rang in my head. "You must not open the door beyond the edge." Perhaps it referred to some cosmic threshold I had unknowingly crossed by receiving that message. I practically threw myself into my car, fumbling the keys as I jammed them into the ignition. The engine coughed to life. My mind churned with scenes of that monstrous silhouette in the corridor, the layered voice, and a freezing touch that nearly claimed me. Even outside, my breath was shallow, adrenaline spiking dangerously high. As I pressed my foot on the gas and tore out of the parking lot, gravel spitting in my wake, a part of me whispered that running might not save me. That whatever latched onto me in the airwaves could follow me anywhere. But I had no other choice. So I fled into the desert night, axe lying on the passenger seat, logbook and recorder haphazardly tossed on the floor. Each mile I put between myself and that station felt like a small reprieve, but not a complete escape. My phone had no signal. It rarely does out here. Dread twisted my gut the entire drive back. The empty highway rolled in front of me, and I had no idea where to go or who to tell. Would anyone believe me if I shared this experience? The words, the shape, the paranoia that maybe it still clung to me in some intangible way. How do you report that? I kept checking the rear view, half expecting to see something hideously elongated bounding after my car. The road stayed empty. Still, dread gnawed at me, telling me this wasn't over. Something had crossed into my world, and hearing its voice was only the beginning. The voice had said, "You must see." I worried that in the nights that followed, I would see, and I wouldn't survive whatever that revelation entailed. The only thing I'm sure of is this. My job was to monitor radio frequencies, and tonight I heard something beyond explanation. Something not quite human, or maybe once human, calling out across the static, carrying with it an entity that defies the boundaries we assume keep us safe. There's a dark corner of reality out there, sitting just beyond our normal range of reception. And I opened myself to it when I turned that dial. Even though I've left the station behind, I know deep down that it's only a matter of time before the signal finds me again, an invisible tether linking me to the thing that hunts in the spaces between transmissions. I can't shake the feeling that no matter where I drive, I'll eventually hear that whisper in the static once more, urging me to listen, urging me to look behind me. If it does, will I have the strength to turn off the radio, or will I be drawn back, compelled to understand this terror that lurks at the edges of our comprehension? Whatever happens next, it's too late to pretend ignorance. I've tuned in. I've heard it. And it has undoubtedly heard me too.